So I've heard from a fair number of people that they don't really understand the enthusiasm around Echoes of Angmar, and they're not particularly interested in playing it because the combat doesn't seem to be engaging enough for them. They say that the combat's too slow, and they just can't be interesting for advanced players. You know, with the speed of execution being one of the main benchmarks for skill in LOTRO over the last 10 years, they feel that Echoes of Angmar just doesn't have a high enough skill cap to keep them interested. I just wanted to dispel those myths, because it's just not true. Is the rate of skill use in Echoes of Angmar slower than retail LOTRO? Yes, and I don't think anybody is denying that. On retail, you do one skill every second, sometimes even more than that, depending on how you use your animation cuts. And on Echoes of Angmar, you do one skill every 2 seconds, and in some cases, with really slow weapons, you're doing one every 3 seconds. So it's definitely slower on that front. But is optimal combat in Echoes of Angmar slower than in retail LOTRO? No. Echoes of Angmar is faster. So sure, retail's got the faster button match, but Echoes of Angmar has much faster peak gameplay with a higher APS requirement, a higher skill cap for most classes, a larger emphasis on good movement with huge rewards for being positional on your target, more dynamic decision making in combat, and a much deeper gearing system and stat system, which honestly, that last part is the part that excites me the most. So I bet you're wondering how it's possible for Echoes to be faster when the skills take twice as long to execute or more. So let me go ahead and use an example here. Let's do a side-by-side comparison between Retail Champion and the Echoes Champion. So for Retail LOTRO, you pick a line, and then you get a bunch of skills, and then for most of them, you just mash them as hard and as fast as possible off cooldown in the optimal order to maximize your DPS. And, you know, on the side, you have a handful of defensive or offensive cooldowns, which you use for bursts of offense or defense, but that's about it. And 100% of your time is spent mashing those buttons on the target. Don't even think about peeling off for defensive purposes. Don't even think about peeling off for off-tanking. Don't even think about peeling off for debuffing or disruption or slows or anything like that. You are mashing those buttons on the target, or you are wasting your time. That's just the way it is on live. That's the way it's been for a very long time. So a lot of the culture that's developed around this has been around who can mush their buttons faster than the other person. Echoes of Angmar adds an entirely new dimension to this by allowing you to swap any piece of weapon, jewelry, or armor in combat with very few restrictions. So many modern players will remember weapon swapping because it was a thing as recently as 5 years ago before they removed it. Weapon swapping is going to be an absolutely huge part of Echoes of Angmar, with certain skills benefiting a lot more from certain types of weapons and wieldings than others. And you're going to have to figure out how your rotation is going to work in with that and how that's going to interact with global cooldowns and speed. So already here we have a huge amount of APS that's going to go into getting the swaps correct. Also, something you're going to have to think about is what skills you are going to use. It's not like on live where you can mash them all and have them all go off. You're going to have to choose what's the optimal choice. So for instance here, you're going to have to choose as your spender. Do you use Remorseless Strike? It's the more optimal choice when you have a low amount of crit and are encountering a lot of BPE, because it goes through BPE and it has a low critical magnitude. Versus if you have a lot of crit, like let's say it's got counter defense on it and doesn't have that much BPE because it's gotten debuffed, something like Brutal Strikes would be the more optimal choice because it has a high critical magnitude but doesn't have the same penetration as Remorseless Strike. Something else that you'll have to do for optimal play is to perform a proper defensive peel, which is not something that Champion has been asked to do in the last 10 years to any meaningful extent. You have to use the Horn Stun PvP. It's a huge defensive tool. There is no audacity reduction. It's the full 3 seconds of stun. You have to use the hamstring on one of the targets to slow them and keep the kite up. You have to use Raging Blade in PvE to take aggro off the Minstrel. You have to use the taunt. You have to use Glory. You have to use Rising Ire to get more aggro from random adds so that you can help your group survive or fill in for the tank if they die, right? It's not something that Champion's been asked to do. It's a huge part of Echoes of Angmar, and it requires a lot of gear swap to perform correctly. Something else that you'll also have to keep in mind is self-buffing skills. which you'll have to work into your rotation and decide whether you need to use them right now or not. And they will compete with your DPS skills for fervor consumption and for time in your rotation, and so and for defeat responses and power. So you'll have to do that and make those calls dynamically in combat based on the situation. It's not a clear-cut choice. Also, another play, which is a completely valid offensive or defensive play in both PvE and PvP, is the disruption play, where you go on a target, either like a Black Arrow or a War Leader or an NPC that's nearby or something. You go in and you start clobbering, clobber, horn, try to disrupt them as much as possible. That's a valid play on Champion. That is not a valid play on Champion on Live. It is distinct to Echoes of Angmar, and you'll need to make that choice whether you want to stay on the target and keep DPSing, or whether you got to peel off and do some disruption on the Black Arrow or do some disruption on the War Leader, prevent them from healing, right? It's a choice, and it's a valid choice, and it actually does have some merits where it is the optimal play. So you have to keep that in mind as you're going through combat. Of course, you've got your defensive cooldowns, and they are very, very impactful here on Echoes of Angmar, a lot more impactful than they are on Live. But they also come with a downside, at least some of them do. Dire Need taking your power, that's pretty yikes. Sudden Defense is a huge BPE buff, but it also requires that you drop Fervor, so your power regen is going to go down, and you are not going to be doing damage much while that is going on. So you also have to swap in. You can swap into heavy shields and stuff like that. You can sprint a little bit. Again, long cooldowns, very impactful, but also have negative downsides. It's not something that you really see on Live with those defensive cooldowns there. Another cool thing about Echoes of Angmar is that, unlike Live, where you have to specialize into either single target or AoE, and if you don't, you basically just don't do that kind of damage, you can do both here. You can choose whether you go single target damage or AoE damage, and they can both be almost equally impactful depending on your trading, right? So it's not an either-or situation. You can switch between them dynamically based on what's currently going on. If you're in the middle of a pack of creeps or a pack of mobs, you can do AoE, and then once you're on a single target, then you can just go single target, and those are both completely valid, very powerful plays that both exist simultaneously on your character. You can swap between them at any time. Something else that you'll also have to keep in mind while you're changing your stats around with all this in-combat swapping is the high power cost versus low power cost skills, right? Some skills will cost a lot of power compared to their damage that they do, and some will cost very little. So, skills like Swift Strike, Remorseless Strike, Blade Storm, they will cost a lot of power for the damage that they output, versus Wild Attack, Brutal Strikes, and Blade Wall. Those will be relatively cheap options. So if you're sort of swapping over towards the low power side of things, if you're running out of power, then you can move towards those skills and away from the high cost skills, versus maybe, like, let's say you're towards the end of a fight and you just want to finish it off, have guaranteed kill, then you can go towards the high cost options and not worry about those running out of power there towards the end. Looking more in depth at what this kind of swapping looks like on an overall gear level, not just the weapons, you can take a look at the stats here. I got an example of a champion here, level 50. So the first thing that I hear about when I talk about swapping a lot of times is people say, like, Unga Bunga, just make a macro to swap it all at once and then swap it all back, right, to whatever situation you need. But it doesn't work like that. There's a limit, right, to how much you can swap in a given time period. So you can swap weapons pretty fast, right? But if you start swapping like more than 5 or 6 items, in a given time frame, like 5 seconds or something, it starts to slow you down. So I'd say on average, across like a long duration, you can probably do maybe like 1 per second in terms of a swap. That's just a guesstimate from me. So what that means is that, you want to do a lot of fast weapon swaps, sure. But then if you want to transition your stats away from what you got currently into some other statting, you're going to have to slowly transition attunement, right? You're going to have to attune yourself towards a certain direction in terms of survival or in terms of DPS as the situation evolves. So it's not all in one deal, right? You're going to have to spread it out over a certain period of time while you're including your weapon swaps as well, or doing whatever it is that you're doing. So let's say you're in like a middle of the road build, and you want to attune yourself more towards the DPS side of things, then you'll need to slowly swap your gear into something with more agility, more might, and more melee critical chance if you're a champion. And that at the cost of morale, vitality, will, BPE, obviously, and then some of your armor and bits and resists. You can transition away from those things with a neutral sort of position on a fate, because you still need fate for in-combat power regen. Champion still chugs a lot of power even with fervors, so that's what you would transition towards in terms of your statting. And the statting, on a lot of these items is very diverse, right? It's not like on live where it's just essences and you can just sort of do whatever. There's a lot of very diverse statting on these things, so you have to figure out what's the optimal gear to do that swap with, right? What you want to trade in and trade out. Conversely, if you're getting focused and you want to survive, you're going to have to transition away from that offensive stuff. You're going to want to, first of all, swap out your weapons for a shield, so you're going to have to want to go sword and board. Either heavy shield or light shield, doesn't matter. Transition away from the critical chance and all that stuff. You want to get your BPE up, get your armor and resists up, and you're going to want to drop your fate, drop your will, drop your power, get more vitality if you can, because that gives more mitts as well. But neutral on agility and might, actually, because might and agility are also defensive stats, because they also give you block, parry, evade, and also a fair amount of common mitigation from might as well. So you're going to want to balance your stats that way. You have to figure out which stats you're going to go for based on what you're getting hit with as well. So having a very diverse gear set in your bags is going to be important for the defensive phase. When you're getting focused, you want to have that defensive stuff in your back pocket. So you're saying, okay, I'm getting hit with spiders. Okay, I'm just going to get a lot of poison resist on me right now. Another thing that's going to be huge for the soloers out there is going to be this sort of offensive transition play, where you start off with a large amount of morale. In fact, the most morale you can get on yourself, with very, very defensive statting and defensive build with a lot of resists and a lot of BPE if you can, if you're a class that benefits from it. And then as you fight, you will swap out your pieces with morale for pieces with more DPS. As your morale drops from the fight, you will swap in more offensive pieces to the point where before you die, you are basically in your most glassy build, right? If your morale is getting very low. And that's going to give you some more morale buffer on your morale on your bones. You're going to be able to survive a lot better. It's going to be a very advanced play, and you're going to have to design that whole transition. And it might change based on who you're fighting. There might be a different transition for spiders versus wards versus reavers, right? Again, mainly a solo play because you don't really do this in group, but it's a very interesting exercise, and it's going to require a lot of decision-making on the fly. Another decision to be made is what kind of damage type, what kind of weapon do you want to swap to? Do you want to swap to something here like the Hill Defender when you're fighting underneath War Leader banners for the increased in-combat power regen? Because they're going to be running light mitigations, so maybe you do the more advanced play, you outthink them, and you just go for something unexpected like Ancient Dwarf with some more ICPR. Or are you fighting alongside a Red Minstrel and they're doing 10% light mitigation debuff with their anthems and stuff? You go for a light damage greatsword and you try going with that to benefit from the additional penetration from the Red Minstrel, right? Those are some dynamic decisions that you have to make. So it's good to have multiple choices, multiple options in your bags so that you can make the right choice, have them on your bar ready to go. One more thing I want to talk about is global cooldowns. Global cooldowns did make some classes very, very, very slow to play if they are wielding certain kinds of exceptionally slow weapons like two-handed hammers and axes. But the good news is that there is a way to play around it for most classes. Some classes are still going to get hammered by them, but let me just talk about that real quick. First of all, the weapon's speed is an indicator of the GCD of skills used with that weapon. So 1.6 speed means there's a 1.6 second delay between the beginning of the skill's execution and the beginning of the next skill's execution. Same thing with the axe, right? 3.1 speed means there's a 3.1 second delay. So obviously that's a huge delay, right? But the good news is that the slower weapons get additional bonus damage, and they just generally have higher damage to begin with. So their slowness in comparison to other weapons and each other is made up for. So they do the same DPS, And you can use that to your advantage depending on what skills you're using. If you have a skill that's on a very long cooldown, it's acceptable to use it slowly, right? You can swap into something that's very slow, and then you can swap back to something that's very fast for weapons that have lower, for skills that have lower cooldowns and that you want to be a little bit more spammy with. So you can play around the GCD a fair amount that way. Something else to note is that the GCD only comes into effect if the animation of the skill is shorter than the GCD, and in a lot of cases it's not, right? So for a lot of the burglar stuff, the animation is longer, right? So it really depends on the class, it really depends on the skill. It is not in effect a lot of the times, and it can also be reduced by attack duration. So we're talking about things like Warcry from Cappy, right? Reduces the attack duration for the whole group. We're talking about stuff like Flurry, right? It reduces the GCD by the percentage listed on the tooltips. So that can really cut down on your GCDs and make you more limited to the actual animations. A lot of the classes that were impacted by the GCD change, they're not going to get their same speed back, right? But they shouldn't get their same speed back. A lot of them were overpowered, and also a lot of them just, again, they would have completely thrown off the balance without that GCD thing. So as painful as it is for some classes, the good news is the majority of classes don't suffer overtly from it, and you can play around it by only swapping into the two-handed, really slow stuff for certain spenders if you really need to. You don't have to be full-time two-handed. You can play around it a little bit, and it doesn't have to be as painful as just sitting there and waiting for every single skill to take 3 seconds, right? It really doesn't have to be like that. So in conclusion, there's a lot of depth to EOA combat, gearing, and the intersection between the two, right? Gear swapping, that just does not exist on Live. So the skill cap, I think, is unquestionably higher. Taking this all into account, there is a lot of opportunity for some very deep advanced plays there. And on top of all of this, there's also the looming fellowship maneuver stuff, right? In both PvE and PvP, proper execution of fellowship maneuvers, and their interaction with your gear. It's not something I've covered here, but they also do take from your stats and from your weapons and so forth. Having those be properly aligned and having everybody execute them efficiently, that's another layer of skill that's added to the top of all this, right? So Echoes of Angmar, guys, I'm telling you guys, it's the most advanced version of LOTRO. It's got the highest skill cap, right? Sure, some of the skills play a little bit slower, but there's so much else that you should be doing, that you should be thinking about. You're going to feel like you're pressed for time, right? Unlike on Live, where you're just sitting there and you're doing your rotation, you're spamming your heals, you're spamming your DPS. There's a lot more thought in Echoes of Angmar. There's a lot more depth, and it's going to have a skill cap that is way, way, way higher than anything that we've seen in the last 10 years for LOTRO, right? It's only going to get deeper the more we discover. There are certain fellowship maneuvers for creeps, right? There's hundreds of fellowship maneuvers for creeps, and they all do slightly different things. Crazy debuffs and how they interact with creeps and stuff like that. So lots of depth. I'm really excited. I'm going to be doing more videos here when I discover stuff and talk about things for gearing and stuff. So stay tuned, and thanks for watching.